Okay, so it is the 30th of June, and we'll be continuing on with the nervous system. I've got to look into my crystal ball right now, and I know that next week you're going to feel like you're being pulled in about 3 different directions. Because next week you're going to have an exam on Monday, right? Is that correct? On the nervous system. And also next week you're going to have a double pre-lab. Right? There's actually 2 weeks of pre-lab due, and that's over the cardiovascular system. And then next week during lab, we're going to ask you to do a quiz over the digestive and endocrine systems. So you're going to feel really pulled, right? I'm just predicting the future. So get out your little Gumby thing, right? Feel, you're going to get pulled a little bit. You're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable, and I understand that. So do the very, very best you can on getting your pre-labs done. Do the very, very best you can on preparing for that lab quiz next week. And certainly you're going to spend most of your focus on the nervous system that we're dealing with here. Remember, that whole pre-lab and that whole lab quiz are only worth 5 points each. It's not a major deal. Yes, the time comes and it's due, but this is an 80-point exam. So you want to spend the majority of your time focusing on this exam. The other thing is that I will be pre-recording a lecture probably tomorrow and posting it. It'll be a YouTube video, and it's going to cover your last chapter, the autonomic nervous system. Just because of the time crunch in the summer, that extra lecture will be necessary. It will be on the exam. And today I'll be covering the spinal cord. On Wednesday, I'll be primarily talking about the brain. And that'll leave with just a little bit of information that will get carried over. And so I'll get that lecture prepared and an email detailing that as soon as possible. Regarding this next exam, you have vocabulary 51 through 70, is that correct? And that's going to include from this vocabulary here. So we went through the first 7 slides, I believe, last Wednesday. Let's go through the next 7 slides now, and then I'll ask if there are any questions or concerns logistically as we move forward. So morphology, the study of neurons. I mentioned to you that neurons come in 3 different morphologies: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar, as a way of thinking about that term. The morula is a mulberry. It's a solid ball of cells. It's an early stage of your development. So even before you get to the blastula, your little embryo was a solid ball of cells referred to as the morula. Remember that the osteoclast is a multinucleated cell. So is skeletal muscle. So multinucleated meaning many nuclei. Muta, we discussed back in chapter 3 or 4 that a mutation is a change in the DNA. So muta meaning change. And myo, we've seen that prefix used a lot referring to muscle. Narcotics cause numbness. The nasal bone, is part of your nose, the nas, the nose. And NAT, referring to birth, prenatal, before birth, postnatal, after birth. Then NATR, why in the world is Na, the chemical symbol for sodium, from the Latin for natrium, is where we get this. So Na or NATR, anything in the root word like natriuresis would be a high sodium in the urine, or natremia would be a high level of sodium within the blood. Necro, dead. Necrotic tissue is dead or dying tissue. Neo, new. Newborn, right, neonate. When you see the prefix nephro, it'll be dealing with the kidney. Nephrology, the study of the kidneys, will deal with the nephron, a structure within the kidney later on. Nod is a knot-like structure, K-N-O-T, and non is another one of those negating terms meaning not. Nodo, your primitive backbone is a notochord. Neuro, we've seen that a lot now, neurolemma. What's a neurolemma? The outer layer of a nerve. Axolemma, the outer layer of an axon. Sarcolemma, the outer layer of a muscle cell. OB, we've seen the obturator foramen. And through the obturator foramen travels the obturator nerve. But this prefix OB, honestly, I think is a little bit difficult. It means against or toward or in front of. And OC also means against. If you have a malocclusion, or mal means bad, And so malocclusion, you go to the dentist and they say, you know, you have a malocclusion. Your teeth are not coming together well, right? There's a bad alignment, or there's something blocking or against your teeth, not allowing them to close properly. Ophthalm and oculo, both referring to the eye. We've seen the orbicularis oculi muscle, the round sphincter muscle around the eye. Ophthalmology, the study of the eye. Odontoid, we saw odontoid process, that tooth-like process. We better like the spelling for dens, right? D-E-N-S, a lot easier. But that bump found only on C2. Oid, in the shape of, so sigmoid, odontoid, you name it. If it ends in oid, it's in the shape of. And ol, something that's small or little, arterial, small arteries. We'll be discussing those in lab next week. And I'll finish up with this one today. Oligo, few or deficient oligodendrocyte. Right? Oligodendrocyte, a cell with a few what? Tree-like, right? Dendros, branches that reach out and do what? Myelinate neurons or axons found where? Oligodendrocytes made the myelin for neurons within the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, what do we have instead? Schwann cells. Right, Schwann cells. Oma, if it ends in oma, some sort of tumor or growth. Onco, cancer. An oncogene is a gene that is responsible for cancer. OO and OV, you'll see like an oocyte or ovum referring to the egg. And then we're going to be finishing up going through this list through phleg, correct? So it's going to be phleg, and we agreed it was back to, is it leg? Was there an issue there, though? Your 51 started with something different? Did you have ladder? Leuco? Okay. Leuco, very good. And Leuco shows up on the next one anyway, so we're in good shape. Okay, so 51 through 70 on the next exam. That'll be next Monday. And let's take a look at the spinal cord. Cool stuff, right? Spinal cord, the whole nervous system is just a fascinating system to study. So today, again, we'll deal with this chapter on the spinal cord. That'll leave primarily the brain to deal with on Wednesday, and that extra lecture to deal with in the meanwhile. So if I say the spinal cord, what comes to mind at first? We've seen a little bit of this in lab. And a lot of the structures that we mentioned in lab now are going to come into full focus. And you're going to want to go back, I would imagine, and look through your Amerman book again. Look at that list of structures. Match up the things that we're covering today. And make sure you have an understanding of it from a structural standpoint. And then what I'll be focusing on today, hopefully, is in addition to the structure, how does this work? How does this whole thing go together? So what do we know about the spinal cord? About as big around as what? Your pinky, right, or pencil. It's traveling down from the brain, continuous, goes through the foramen magnum, and then passes down through all of the vertebral foramina, and itself ends at about where? L1, where it comes to a point at the end. We call that point the conus medullaris, or the medullary cone. But even below L1, there are still nerve roots, what we'll call roots, coming down. And the collection of all those roots makes up what's called the cauda equina, the horse's tail. And we recognize that it's really just the link, right, between the brain and the rest of the body. It's this cord-like structure, but it isn't just a link. It also has its own job. And the primary job of the spinal cord, in addition to being a linker from the brain to the rest of the body, is reflexes, right? So as was mentioned in lab, the spinal cord is responsible for your reflexes. Coming off from the spinal cord, we know about those 31 pairs of nerves broken into regions that we already know: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. And then there was also that one little pair of coccygeal nerves at the very end. These nerves are a pathway for both incoming sensory and outgoing motor impulses. Remember that the information traveling through a neuron is what? Information traveling through a single cell is unidirectional. Right? So we talk about information coming in the dendrite, being processed by the soma, and leaving down the axon. But in a nerve, what's different? A nerve is actually a bundle of what? A nerve is a bundle of axons. And the other term for axons in that context is a nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers. Right? So an axon is a nerve fiber. This bundle of nerve fibers are all traveling together. They're encased. Right? Remember that there was the endoneurium and the epineurium that we saw. So traveling together are a bunch of axons. And within that nerve, some of those fibers are sensory, and often some of those fibers are motor. So that means that the information going, for example, through your brachial nerve includes both sensory information coming in from your arm going up to your brain, and information coming from your brain down your arm, right, brachial region, to the muscles of your arm. And like I said, the spinal cord is also responsible for your reflexes. So structurally, we've already seen most of this. It's about 16 to 18 inches long in the average adult. We know that it's like a pencil, but there is a little bit of a flat side to it. So if you were to take some Play-Doh and make a little snake between your hands and make a perfect long cylinder and then laid it down on the table, there would be a little bit of an indentation on both the front and the back sides of the spinal cord. And also along the length of that flattened surface, there would be a depression. In the Amerman book, I believe those were called the fissures or the sulci. I forget which one now your Amerman book calls those. But there's a little bit of a discrepancy in some books. Some books will call the posterior median sulcus. Other books will call it the posterior median fissure. So I'm not going to differentiate between those two terms. Where have you seen the word fissure before? The longitudinal fissure, that very deep groove between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And where have you seen the word sulcus before? The little grooves between all the gyri. So in my mind, a fissure is a very deep groove, and a sulcus is a very not so deep groove. But again, some books kind of flip those terms around, so I'm not going to care about it. If you put sulcus or fissure, I'll be good with it. The rest of it's pretty easy, right? There's the anterior or posterior, front or back, median in the middle, groove, sulcus or fissure. So we'll see this on both the front and back sides, these long grooves that go down the length of the spinal cord. The regions of the spinal cord, check, I hope you've got this. So there's the cervical region, and this is going to be continuous with the medulla oblongata. Can you picture the medulla? We saw it in the brain dissection. That oblong region, the extension goes past near the pons, and then is continuous with the spinal cord. And then there's the thoracic region. You would think of this as being the area along the thoracic cavity where there are ribs associated. Coming off from this region, there will be the thoracic nerves. Right? What's the other word for those thoracic nerves? The other name for the thoracic nerves would be the intercostal nerves, because they come off and they travel between the costal cartilage, between the ribs. Then there's the lumbar region. This is a very short region of the spinal cord, and it's actually way up, isn't it? The lumbar region is actually up higher than what we would imagine, and it's called the lumbar region not because it's so much in the lumbar region, but because it's from this area of the spinal cord that all 5 of the lumbar nerves branch off from the spinal cord. So there are the 5 lumbar nerves, and then there'll be even a smaller region called the sacral region. And again, how many sacral nerves are there? 5, right? 5 pairs of sacral nerves. So also from this very small tip, this is almost at the very tip at the conus medullaris. But there is the sacral region of the spinal cord, and it's from there that the 5 sacral nerves come off from the spinal cord. And then the very, very tip would be the coccygeal region, and it's from there that that one pair of the coccygeal nerves arises. The spinal cord we know is shorter than the vertebral canal. The vertebral canal goes all the way down to the sacrum, doesn't it? All the way down. And we know, as we've already said, that the spinal cord itself ends at a tapered point called the conus medullaris in Latin, or in English, the medullary cone. Either one is fine. Below that point, inferior to the conus, are the nerve roots that are going to now come out along the lumbar and sacral regions, and collectively those are referred to as the cauda equina. There is, going right down the center of the cauda equina, a structure, a filament, an anchor called the filum terminale, or the terminal filum. You'll see it written in English or Latin again. And this is going to anchor all of these structures down to the coccyx. Pictures coming for all this in a moment. You know that there are 31 pairs of nerves coming off from the spinal cord. Their names are abbreviated just like the names of the vertebra. So in one context, you would hear that they broke C1. And what they meant is that they broke the atlas, the bone. And in another context, you would hear there was damage to C1, and they're talking not about the bone, but about the nerve. So you have to be really kind of careful in context. Is the writer referring to C1, the bone, or C1, the nerve? Okay? Because they're just abbreviated the same. Now, the cervical region of the vertebral column, we know there are only 7 cervical vertebrae, but in this area there are 8 cervical nerves. There's the first nerve actually is coming from between the occipital bone and the atlas. So there are 8 cervical nerves. And then there are 12 thoracic nerves coming off. Straight enough. Now the numbers from this point kind of make sense. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae, so there are also 5 lumbar nerves. And the sacrum is fused. There are 5 sacral structures that fuse to make the sacrum as a single bone. And there are 5 sacral nerves that pop out through the dorsal sacral foramina. And then finally at the very, very tip, there's one nerve referred to as CO, sometimes CO little 1. You wouldn't want to confuse it with cervical, right? So the CO is the coccygeal nerve, or CO1. So in a picture like this, the vertebrae are numbered, actually not the vertebra, but the nerves are numbered for us from top to bottom. So you can see C1 down through C8. They're shown in purple. The purple would be the cervical region. No differentiation here. So the purple region is the cervical region of the spinal cord, and from it there are 8 nerves. And then the orange region, right, there are 12 thoracic nerves coming off the thoracic region. Where it gets interesting is right here. The blue region of the spinal cord on this image is the lumbar region. And it's from that little tiny area that L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5 are merging off. And then there's going to be, and it's not even shown very well in this slide, a little bit of pink right there at the very, very end. You might say, well, that's the conus medullaris, and you're right. But in that conus medullaris, in that narrowing point, there's a little bit of a pink area on the drawing. And that refers to the sacral region. And it's from that little region of the spinal cord that S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5 are coming off. And all these nerves are traveling down as what? All those nerves collectively we call the cauda equina, that horse's tail. All those nerves coming down below the conus medullaris. And then in this drawing, they do label CO1. I don't think they really differentiate it in a different color. But then you'll also see in this image a green structure that comes all the way down. It's coming straight down from the conus medullaris and anchoring down to the coccyx. And that green structure is the filum terminale, or the terminal filum. It's this last little structure that's going to anchor all of these nerves down to the coccyx. You can also see on this image, getting a little ahead of myself, but there are places where the nerves cluster together. So up in the neck is the cervical plexus. Now you've only been asked to know one nerve from the neck. The only nerve you need to know up there is what? What's the only nerve you've been asked to know from the neck region? The phrenic nerve. So on a practical or on an exam, if it were to say, name this group of nerves, the answer would have to be cervical plexus. If instead the sticker said, name this nerve, the only nerve you've learned up there is the phrenic, so it must be the phrenic nerve. Again, keep your answers in the box, right? We only have a few thousand structures to know, and there's no reason to answer outside the box. So just, think about, what have I asked you to know? I'm not going to ask you to label something that you weren't asked to know. Then there are a series of nerves that come off to the arm. Those are the brachial, the nerves that go off to the brachium are the brachial plexus. There is no thoracic plexus, right? And there is no thoracic plexus because each nerve comes off and is separated beautifully by the ribs. So there's no opportunity for them to cluster. Then there is a clustering of the lumbar nerves called the lumbar plexus. Now that group of nerves actually goes down the front of the leg. Okay, so the lumbar plexus goes down the front of the leg, and then the sacral plexus are a group of nerves coming off from the sacrum, and as you can see, they're traveling back behind the os coxa. So they're traveling, that group of nerves is traveling down the back of the leg. Taking a look at the spinal cord from a cadaver. Up here is the brain. That white coating up here is the what? We can see the white coating on the brain. That's the dura. Okay, you saw it on your sheep brain, some of you as well. And here is some of the cerebellum. Okay, so now you know where you are. So the cerebellum, and coming up from underneath that would be the spinal cord itself. Spinal cord is attached up to the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. The occipital bone's been removed, hasn't it? But this deep line would be the occipital bone, and the spinal cord would be slipping down through the foramen magnum. As you look down the length of the spinal cord, you can see an indentation right down the center. Again, that would be the what? Posterior median sulcus or fissure. There would be another groove likewise on the anterior surface that we can't see here. The spinal cord is protected by a series of layers that have been moved away. So what's been taken away here is the dura. You don't see that. It's been removed so you can see the actual spinal cord. Also coming off from the spinal cord, it looks like some hairs. So all of those hairs here are called the rootlets. Let means what? Little, right? So the rootlets are little roots, if you will. So you'll see a cluster here and a cluster here, then a cluster here and a cluster here, those rootlets. Going down a little further inferior, now, right about here, and I know it's hard to see, but right about here is the conus medullaris. The actual spinal cord ends up there. And so that means that everything coming down below that is part of what? All these would be part of the cauda equina. Those roots are all traveling down through the foramen magnum, or sorry, through the vertebral foramina, down through all the L1, L2, L3, L4, L5, right, down into the sacrum. And here you can see that they have pulled back the dura. So the dura mater has been pulled back, reflected back so that you can see everything nicely. You can also see in this image the nerves. I mean, here's a nerve coming off, yellow. Here's another one. Here's another one. You can also appreciate, if you look really closely, there's a thicker line going right down the center of this thing. Do you see that? Kind of a thick line, and that would be the phylum terminale, or the terminal phylum. You know about the meninges. We went through this in lab, I think, pretty carefully. So if you were to take a syringe and you were going to go from the outside and go all the way down to the spinal cord, what layers would you have to penetrate through, and actually beyond this list? So let's start off with the outside. Let's talk about the skin, right? So we'd have to go through the epidermis, then we'd have to go through the dermis, and then we'd have to go through the hypodermal layer or the subcutaneous layer, and then we would hit some muscle, and then, right, that's not even shown here. So after we got through the skin and some fat and some muscle, then we would hit some bone. So let's start there with this slide. We would hit the vertebra, wouldn't we? And if we bend over, then the vertebra would have some space in between them, and now the needle could continue through to the epidural space. The epidural space is largely a fat-filled region. There's also some blood vessels in there. And then we would hit what? Past the fat of the epidural space would be the dura itself, that hard outer layer. It's not rock hard, but it's thicker, isn't it? And then once we penetrated through the dura, then you'd be in a space called the subdural space, just space just underneath the dura, before you hit the arachnoid mater. And then once you got past the arachnoid mater, below that is a subarachnoid space. And what is in that? What do we find in the subarachnoid space? Right? That's the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? So that subarachnoid space is where the CSF is found. And remind me, what cells make this CSF? What cells are making, I just heard it, ependymal cells, right? So remember, these are some of the glial cells, the helper cells, and the ependymal cells are the ones making the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. Once you got past the CSF, then you would hit the layer that's shrink wrapped to the spinal cord itself, and that would be the pia. So just appreciate those layers. Think about those layers of protection, either solid or fluid-filled, fat-filled spaces between the outside world and the actual spinal cord. So when we look at this image, again, we spent most of our time looking at vertebra with an opening in the middle. And here the spinal cord is filling up its rightful place. We don't see the vertebral foramen. We recognize that, well, actually, what kind of vertebra is this? Let me back up. I wouldn't ask you this now, but you should recognize this as a particular type of vertebra, and then you're going to tell me why. What am I hearing? Thoracic. Why are you saying that, Nancy? You're right. Yeah, I can't see the giraffe too much here, but you're right. It would be a giraffe-looking vertebra in another angle. But there's something else about the vertebra that we know. It doesn't have the transverse foramina, so it's not cervical. So we're down to kind of, is it thoracic or is it lumbar? Kind of, right? And we really can't see giraffe or moose-like silhouettes here. But there's something here that your eye may not be trained to look for. And that is over on those transverse processes, what does one see? An indentation where there would be some cartilage. And we only find that cartilage where there would be an articulation, and in this case, an articulation with ribs, right? So you know that this is one of the thoracic vertebrae because you can see where the ribs would articulate to those transverse processes. So we're looking at a thoracic vertebra and spinous process, right? So we know we're on the posterior side as we look at the top. If we weren't sure of our anatomy as far as the bone goes, how else could I always tell the posterior from the anterior view of a spinal cord? Look at the horns, the wings, if you will, of the butterfly, and they always go up and touch at the back end. So you'll always see the wings, the horn areas of the butterfly going up and touching pretty much right to the edge of the spinal cord, whereas you won't see that happening at the ventral side. So what else do we have here? Here's the entire spinal nerve. Okay? And in the lab, that's all we see. We don't see anything else. In the lab picture, in the vertebra, right, that vertebral column that we have looks like a chiropractor model, and all those nerves, those yellow nerves are coming out, all those 31 pairs of nerves. You don't see anything other than just the nerve sticking out, do you? So the rest of this, the only place we get to see it is in a cartoon like this, or in that model we have in the lab, that flat section of the spinal cord, right? When that big three-dimensional model of the spinal cord. So we look and we see the spinal cord itself, and let's go through layers. The layer touching the spinal cord would be what? The pia, yes? And let me try to get a better marker color. And then this white layer right along here would be what? The deeper layer would be the arachnoid. And below it, in this dark area, would be the fluid. So in that darker gray area, all of this area would be the subarachnoid space filled up with the CSF. So if I made it all blue, right, that'd be all fluid-filled regions in there. And then on the outside, just underneath the fat, right, that layer there would be the what? The dura, right? And then the fat-filled region would be the subdural space. Sorry, epidural space. Misspoke. The epidural space.
What are the fibers?
The fibers are what give it the name arachnoid motor. It looks like a spider web. Okay, so they're just fibers. They're kind of giving structure in there. There are no names for them that we're using. What else? I think that's about it for now. I do want to point out a couple of things because you're asked to know them, and we'll see them over and over the next few hours as you listen to this lecture. This bulge right there is the what? Dorsal root ganglion, also called the posterior root ganglion. It's not labeled here. It's not the focus here, but I want you to see that as often as possible. Also, what is it that makes up the nerve? What makes up the nerve are two roots. So this whole thing is the nerve, right? But the nerve itself is made up of this would be the posterior root, and this would be the anterior root, and they combine to make the spinal nerve. More on that as we keep going through this. Now you saw these images, similar ones, in the lab last week. They had different colors, but the structures were the same. Here we can see the three meningeal layers pretty clearly. So in this particular cartoon, this grayish area, this is the dura. It's the outer, more tough layer. Then there's going to be a rather delicate layer. This is the arachnoid layer. What would be in between those? We would call it the subdural, right? Subdural layer. There's nothing in there, just a space. Then what is shrink wrapped right to the surface? The pia. And in between, what would be in between the arachnoid and the pia? The subarachnoid space, which is filled with CSF, right? So we don't see any fluid here in the picture. Here the roots are labeled for you. So in this picture, there's the posterior root versus the anterior root. And when both those roots get together, the whole thing is the spinal nerve.
Can you know that the posterior root always has the ganglion?
The posterior root always has the ganglion attached, yes. Now, I'm going to go ahead and jump since you asked that question, and I've said the posterior root ganglion twice. I need you to flip back to the very first slide of chapter 12, I do believe. And the very first slide of chapter 12 said, what is the central versus the peripheral nervous system? And it said the peripheral nervous system was the brain and the spinal cord. And then it said chapter 11, right? The first nervous system chapter. And it said under the peripheral nervous system that we find what? Peripheral nervous system is made up of nerves, cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and this thing called ganglia. So I'm on the bottom of page 104. Bottom of page 104, lower left, right? And it said the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, was 31 pairs of spinal nerves that we're learning about, 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we'll learn about next time, and ganglia. And it says that a ganglia is what? A group or cluster of cell bodies. And where are we? We're in the peripheral nervous system. So if I could cut into this bulge, what would I find in there? A cluster of nerve cell bodies. What kind of cell bodies? Now, again, I'm stretching us here because I haven't really said this straight up yet. But in there, you're going to find all the cell bodies for the sensory neurons. Okay? So as information is coming back from your finger, from your hand, from your body, it always comes back to the spinal cord, and incoming sensory information always comes in and travels into the posterior root. In that bulge, is actually where all the cell bodies are for those neurons. Now, what shape are sensory neurons? I'm bringing you back to lab last week. And I said that on that table, when you were filling out sensory versus motor versus interneurons, I gave you the word. I said that sensory neurons were always unipolar, which means they look like what? They look like a little circle, comes down and comes to a crossroad, doesn't it? So that's kind of the cartoon of a unipolar neuron. You'll always see the cell body coming down to a T, right? So if I were to cut into this ganglion, I would find these unipolar cell bodies. And these unipolar cell bodies represent all the incoming sensory neurons coming into the spinal cord. Hang in as we keep going through this. While I'm saying this, I might as well label the other side. That means that so that's incoming sensory. The outgoing motor neurons are all going to be traveling through the anterior root. Okay, so the ingoing afferent, right? The afferent signals always go in the posterior root. The outcoming efferent neurons always travel out the anterior root. Hold on, it's going to get easier. Let's look at the spinal cord also in this picture. Gray matter and white matter. In the spinal cord, what's gray? Right? My butterfly. So the butterfly is gray matter. Everything around the gray butterfly is what? White matter. What makes gray matter gray and what makes white matter white? White matter is white because of the presence of myelin. What cells made the myelin? That tick is a nervous tick when I hear the wrong answers. We're in the spinal cord. We're in the central nervous system. Therefore, the white myelin there is made by oligodendrocytes. Right? Remember, the oligodendrocytes are the myelin-producing cells of the CNS, and the spinal cord is part of the CNS. If I were outside in the peripheral nervous system, then the white stuff would be made by Schwann cells. Okay? So what is white matter then? Stuff that is myelinated. And what is myelinated? On the neuron, what is myelinated? Only the axon, right? Okay, so conversely, what is gray matter? Stuff that isn't white. It's not white because it isn't myelinated. If you think back to a slide of a neuron's image, what parts are not myelinated? Soma cell bodies and dendrites. Okay, so the somas, right, the cell bodies and the dendrites are never myelinated. You don't see any Schwann cells, you don't see any oligodendrocytes around those structures. You only see the axons getting myelinated, don't you? So in a general way, what is the spinal cord? What's all the white stuff? What's all the white stuff going up and down the spinal cord around the gray butterfly? Myelinated axons. Okay? And the gray butterfly, therefore, must be predominantly cell bodies and dendrites. Okay? It's all going to be in words here in a moment, but I want us, as much as we can, to start seeing this multiple times, and the more you hear it, you'll start to believe it as we go through this.
Is that when they're coming out from the butterfly this way, or are they going up and down?
Okay, so the white stuff is going up and down. Okay, so hold on. You're thinking exactly correctly. So let me just say in words what I just told you in a picture. In the spinal cord, it is centrally located. What's it? It is gray matter. So in the spinal cord, the gray matter is centrally located. It's in the shape of an H, or I always say a butterfly. This butterfly has two wings, right? The two winged areas. And we know that this gray area the butterfly wings is broken up into areas called horns. I'm not sure why, right? I just remember I have a horny butterfly, right? A butterfly with horns. Now, the horns are broken up anterior, easy enough, right? Anterior toward the front, the lateral toward the side, and the posterior toward the back. And that's really all you need to worry about right now. Just to label the parts of the gray butterfly, there's going to be anterior horn, left and right, lateral horns off to the side, and posterior horns toward the front. Now, not to make it more confusing, you've got this. Other books will use, instead of anterior, they'll use ventral. And some books, rather than posterior, will use dorsal. No big deal, right? So you'll see anterior horn or ventral horn, and you'll see posterior horn or dorsal horn, okay? Not a problem. There's a strip of gray matter that connects the two butterfly wings called the gray commissure. In the very center of that gray commissure, there is a fluid-filled canal, very boringly called the central canal. Different from the central canal seen in the osteon, right? But the same thing, same name, central canal. And this central canal is filled with CSF made by our friends, the ependymal cells. I'm going to come back to the other details within that, okay? But right now, I just want you to remember that the butterfly is broken up into horned areas. And now let's talk about the white matter. So, I need to back up. This is still gray matter. So gray matter, right? We talked about the horns. But I need to introduce a new term to you here, and that is nuclei. Nuclei. Now, if I were to say multinucleated, that a skeletal muscle cell is multinucleated, nuclei, then you know that I'm talking about what? A cell with more than one nucleus. In the center of the cell where the DNA is found. I wish I knew why neuroscientists chose to do this to us, but here the word nucleus means something very, very different. Within the nervous system, a nuclei, a nucleus, is a cluster of cell bodies. Okay? A cluster of cell bodies. Now wait a second, Mac. You just told me that a cluster of cell bodies is a ganglion. Right? So here's the deal. And I'm going to go ahead and do this right now because you guys have all the information you need to do to figure this out. I want you to make basically a little blackboard. If I can get this, there we go, like this. And I want you to put across the top PNS and CNS. And I want you to put makes myelin over here the best you can. What makes myelin in the PNS? Right? Schwann cells, right? What makes myelin in the CNS? Oligodendrocytes, yes? In the PNS, a group of nerve fibers. A group of nerve fibers in the PNS, we're going to call a nerve. Simple enough. But in the CNS, we're instead going to call a cluster, a group of nerve fibers a tract. Now, I mentioned that term in lab last week, but I want to put it here again. Okay, so again, what we have is just different vocabulary depending upon if we're dealing with the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. Functionally, they're the same. Right? So a group of nerves traveling together, we would call it a nerve, right? And where are all the nerves of your body? Go back and look in that first slide of chapter 11. Again, it says, in the peripheral nervous system, one finds nerves. Cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and ganglia. Okay? In the central nervous system, one finds instead Tracts. Same functional idea. What color, if I could cut into a nerve, which is a bundle of axons, what color would it be? White or gray? If I cut into a bundle of axons, aka a nerve, it's what color? White or gray? White, because the axons are protected by Schwann cells. If I cut into a tract, what color is it going to be? White. Why? Because of the myelin made by the oligodendrocytes. Right? Along the axon, it's going to be protected. Now, the last term I want to throw here in this category, I wish I could scroll this little board up. I'm going to go to another one here. Okay. And again, PNS and CNS, just continue down. The last term now is going to be a cluster of cell bodies. And in the PNS, this is called a ganglion. Okay, many ganglia. In the CNS, a nucleus or many nuclei. Okay. So what you've got here are just three different terms used in different ways if you're dealing with the CNS or the PNS. And we'll keep track of them, and they'll begin to make more sense as we start using this vocabulary. Okay, so one nucleus, many nuclei. So now let's go back to this slide. And what I'm telling you is that within the spinal cord, there are areas of gray matter. Okay, so what's a cluster? What makes gray matter gray? Gray matter must be made up of what? Yeah, somas and dendrites. Right? If it's gray, it's a bunch of somas and dendrites. And what did I just say? A bunch of somas is called? A bunch of cell bodies is called a nucleus. Okay? So a bunch of cell bodies is called a nucleus. So therefore, you could consider the horns a what? The horns are gray. The horns of the butterfly are somas. A group of somas hanging together within the central nervous system are called a nucleus. So another way of thinking about the anterior horn, the lateral horn, the posterior horn, all of those, you could think, oh, that's a cluster of cell bodies. And so we could say that those are also nuclei. Okay, hang in there as we pull this together. Now, those other terms on there we're going to come back and look at in a moment. Now, the butterfly, the gray butterfly of the spinal cord is surrounded also by, right, white matter. Right? So we have the gray butterfly, the gray horns, the gray nuclei, surrounded by white matter. Well, why is it white? Ask the same question over and over. Why is this stuff white? Because there's myelin around it. What cells make the myelin? Oligodendrocytes, right? And on each side, we see the term funiculus. So there's a posterior funiculus, a lateral funiculus, and an anterior funiculus. Amerman also uses the word column. Okay, so you can also use the word columns here rather than funiculi. Okay, so column. Okay, so you could have anterior column, might be easier to spell, right? Anterior column, lateral column, and posterior column. It's a fun word, right? Funiculus, fun word, F-U-N. Funiculus, funiculi. Okay, so what did I just tell you? A bunch of white matter traveling up and down the spinal cord would be called what? A bunch of white matter, right? A bunch of axons traveling up and down through the spinal cord would be called tracts. So these funiculi regions are what? These white regions are tracts. And these tracts are going up and down the spinal cord. So these are axons going up and down the spinal cord. And guess what? Some of these tracts are carrying sensory information. That sensory information is going up, isn't it? And in lab, I call that an ascending tract. Some of this information traveling through the funicular regions, through the white regions, through the columns, is descending motor information. And I refer to that in lab as descending tracts. There is a little area of white that connects the left and the right funiculi regions, and you'll see that it's only on the anterior side. So let me go through one more word. In fact, here's everything I'm just telling you. And then we're going to look at a picture and pull this whole thing, together. So again, the white matter around the spinal cord is organized into groups called tracts. Now that in the peripheral nervous system would be called a what? Yeah. So if we were in the peripheral nervous system, we would call that a nerve instead. But we're in the CNS, and we're going to call it a tract. And as I just said, there's sensory information traveling up, so that'd be the ascending tracts. There are descending tracts that are carrying motor information. So that means that a funiculus, right, a funicular region would contain both sensory and motor tracts. What's the other way of saying that? A spinal nerve, right, would contain what? Both motor and sensory, wouldn't it? So again, we're seeing that tracts and nerves carry both sensory and motor information, usually. Let's label this guy. And I like this figure. I like this one, so you might want to put a little star next to this one because it's so clean. It's very easy to label. Everything you need is right there, easy for you to see. So let's break this one down. Let's start with the white matter over here on the left. And it's pretty easy. The white matter, right? The white matter, we got some posterior funiculi, left and right. Each one's a funiculus. We've got white matter on the side, that's lateral, and we got white matter down in the front. That would be anterior funiculi. Easy enough. There is, if you look, a little area right through here that connects the left to the right side, and that would be considered the white commissure. I want you to see, too, that the posterior median sulcus goes deep. Right? It goes really, really deep, and pretty much goes right down to the gray commissure. It goes right down to the where the butterfly wings come together. In the front, not quite as deep, is it? Okay, not quite as deep, and so that's why there is some white area here that can connect one side to the other, the white commissure. Now let's look at the gray matter. The gray matter is on the horns. So again, posterior horn. Sticking out the side, lateral horn. Toward the front, the anterior horn. It could instead say dorsal and ventral horn. The strip of land in between, the gray commissure. In the very center of the gray commissure, there is the central canal, right, filled with CSF. So I like this slide. It's just really easy. It's big, it's bold, it's pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and label a couple more things on this, though. So if I were to circle this entire region, you would call that a what? Spinal nerve, right? The entire nerve. If I were to point just to this area, that would be the anterior root. If I were instead to point back here, that would be the posterior root. You could also call it the dorsal root. The bulge that I'm seeing, I'll go to the other side. The bulge here is the what? Posterior or dorsal root ganglion. So So what is that ganglion? What does it represent? A ganglion is a what? Cluster of cell bodies found where? Peripheral nervous system. We're out of the spinal cord, right? We've come out of the spinal cord. So this posterior root is outside of the spinal cord. So that's peripheral nervous system, and in that bulge would be a cluster of cell bodies. Okay. And we've already said, what kind of cell bodies would be in there? Those are the sensory neurons. And by shape, they're what? Unipolar. They look like little circles that come out to a letter T. If this entire structure here is a root, then these little guys through here would be called rootlets. Okay, so the little tiny branches would be rootlets, making up the entire root. You've seen the spinal cord under the microscope. It looks really cool. I like it. So what can we label on here? First of all, it tells us what's posterior and anterior. But can you appreciate that this horn goes up and pretty much touches the back? So this is, in fact, the posterior. So we would call this region what? This would be the posterior or dorsal horn. Off to the side, lateral horn. And toward the front would be the anterior or ventral horn. The area that connects in between is the gray commissure. In the very center of it, there's this little hole there. That is the central canal. White matter, I know it's not labeled white and gray here, but did you see the different colors? So all this over here in the purple, that'd be the white area. That would be what? Lateral funiculus. Up here would be the posterior funiculus, and down here the anterior or ventral funiculus. This layer that's kind of hot pink around the outside, that's actually the dura. Okay? The dura mater is still shown on this particular slice of the spinal cord. And you can even see the bulge. So that bulge right there is the posterior root ganglion on both sides. Posterior root or dorsal root ganglion. I would not have you label this histological image, but I would definitely have you label this one. So this is a great one to go back and look at carefully. Make sure you can label the parts on that. And then, of all the slides in this chapter, this is the one that I think pulls everything together that I've described so far. And I suspect if you are like I was the first time I heard this, you're like, man, I'm not getting this yet. And that's okay. I'm going to walk through this image very, very slowly. And I'm not going to have you label this one, but it's too busy. There's too much on here to label from a screen perspective if I were to show this to you. But it's really rich. And so if there's one image I would encourage you to stare at, it's this one. Okay? And maybe even, if you got an extra quarter, print it out full size and color in the library. Because this image really is a very rich image. It has a lot of information on it. So let's get started here. Labeling things we know. And I'm going to scribble on this thing and erase it numerous times. From an anatomical standpoint, let's just go through anatomy right now. So this groove right here is the what? Anterior, median, fissure, or sulcus. The groove on the back? Posterior, median, fissure, or sulcus. This entire structure is a spinal nerve, labeled for us. All of this would be the posterior root, and this would all be the anterior root. Okay, so we got the structures down, if you will. Inside the butterfly, they did some color coding for us here, but this lighter blue area we would better call the dorsal or posterior horn. Off to the side, the yellow would be the lateral and the red would be the anterior horn. In between the two butterfly wings, the strap of land is the gray commissure with the central canal. So that's the anatomy, okay? Now, go back to also the beginning of your chapter 11, and there were those tables. I'm going back to, it had rectangles, and it said here are the divisions of the nervous system. And we're talking right back, almost the beginning. I'm on page 105, and I'm looking halfway, the third slide on page 105. And there were those boxes. And remember that the whole nervous system can be broken up into the sensory side and the motor side. And more completely, the sensory side could be further divided up into what? Somatic sensory and visceral sensory. On the motor side, what was there? Somatic motor and autonomic, right? So those four bottom boxes going across that table. Okay, take those four titles, those four portions of your nervous system, and now lift them up, if you will, and oh look, there they are. Okay, so here are the four different parts of your nervous system. In other words, traveling through your nerves are some fibers, some axons, which are part of your somatic sensory neurons. What are they doing? What are somatic sensory neurons doing? They're sensing signals from where? Your soma, your body, primarily on the outside. So what did it tell you in that little box? Somatic sensory was bringing in information from where? Skin, muscles, joints. Okay, toward the outside and the skin of your body. Here they're shown in blue, just to help us to see this. Somatic sensory. Then right next to it there are visceral sensory neurons. They're bringing in sensory information from where? Your viscera, from your internal organs, from your internal environment. Okay, they're shown in the other color blue. Now look where these two blue fibers are going. Do you agree that they're coming in? These are sensory. The other word for incoming is afferent, right? So these are your afferent sensory neurons. They're bringing in both information from your surface and from your gut. And they're coming in, and oh look, they're traveling through the spinal nerve, but they're coming in and they're going where? Notice the blue fibers are only traveling through the posterior root. So from a circuit standpoint, your sensory neurons always come in and travel through the posterior root. What's that bulge? The ganglion. What's in that ganglion? It shows us in very small form. But what's in there are all of the soma, right, for those sensory neurons. So we have that little bulge right there, right outside the spinal cord. And if I could cut into it, what color would it be? What color would the ganglion be primarily? It's mostly cell bodies, so it'd be mostly gray, wouldn't it? Right? Because cell bodies are gray. And I can even see that little, that idea of a unipolar neuron, because I see those little push pins, right? Those two little push pins are in here, representing the little T cross, right? That comes for a unipolar neuron. Because I told you that sensory neurons are unipolar in their shape. So all the incoming sensory information comes in the back door, in the back side, in the posterior root. How might you remember this? If you're having an affair, you always go in the back door. Works. right? So the afferent fibers always come to the spinal cord and then travel in the posterior route. They always come in and go in the, quote, back door, in the posterior route. So that also means that everything that's traveling, all the nervous system information that's traveling through your posterior route is what? Sensory. Everything coming in and traveling through the posterior route is carrying sensory signals. Okay? And then what do these sensory neurons do? They come in and they synapse with what? These darker purple blue guys in here are what? Interneurons. And then what do those interneurons do? They're the collectors, right? They collect this incoming information, they're going to process it, they're going to think about it, and then what's going to happen? They're going to synapse on outgoing motor neurons. Now, through which route do the motor neurons leave? They leave out the anterior route, therefore the entire anterior route is motor. Or, another way of saying that, they're all efferent, right? EFF. So all the outgoing motor information is efferent. But then what happens? I mean, all this comes back together to form what? All four of these fibers are traveling together through your spinal nerves. So if I touch your femoral nerve, your sciatic nerve, your brachial nerve, your ulnar nerve, your radial nerve, your phrenic nerve, and I could tease it apart, and if I could tell the difference, some of the fibers in there are sensory, and some of the fibers in there are motor. The last little bit on this is just the term nuclei, which I'm really glad they put on here, and they did color coding on this for us. So it says right here, sensory nuclei. Again, what's a nucleus? Cluster of cell bodies. And so those cell bodies, look over here. What's happening right there? If I could blow that up, what do I have going on in that circled area right in here? I have the telodendria coming in from the sensory neuron. Right? Are telodendria myelinated? At the very end of an axon, at the axon terminals, do you see Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes down there? No. And they're doing what? They're synapsing to dendrites and to somas of interneurons. So this area in here is all what? Gray. Sure enough, right? The butterfly region is gray, and we're going to call that cluster of gray matter a nucleus. So what's going on here? In this area, what's coming in? The somatic sensory neurons are coming in, and they are synapsing in this area. So that's the somatic sensory nuclei. That's where all the cell bodies are going. If you look more closely, you'll see that the visceral sensory neurons, the darker blue, are coming in, and they're actually synapsing down in this area in the visceral sensory nuclei. On the outgoing side, the autonomic motor fibers are in yellow, and they're more off to the lateral side. And then the somatic motor neurons are more down here in the ventral horn, okay, in the ventral nuclei. Told you there's a lot in this image, right? There really is. It kind of tells and pulls the whole story, both anatomically and functionally, into one image. So stare at it. Go back and listen to this presentation. I'm at minute 69, right? So somewhere between 60 and 69. Go back and just listen to this again while staring at this image. And I think it'll all come into focus. And if it's not in focus now, by the time we finish this conversation today, and then you work through your mastering assignments and read through these key pages in your textbook, it'll all come into focus. It will. It will. I'm going to give you a break there, and we're going to have a long time when we come back. We're going to have almost an hour, but I want to go ahead and give you a break right there, let this kind of settle in, and then think about it and come back with any questions you might have. So the question just came up, the conus medullaris, which would be the end point of the spinal cord. That's spinal cord, right? So that's central nervous system. But when we talk about the nerves coming off the spinal cord, we say that they're nerves, right? And nerves, by definition, are part of the peripheral nervous system. So you know that coming off from the spinal cord, there are 31 pairs, right, of these spinal nerves. And you know them by their name. So we've got the 31 nerves. Now, where are these nerves going? They're the connection, right, between your brain and the spinal cord and the rest of your body. So these nerves are going to go out, and they're going to connect your central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord, to the rest of your body, your brain, your muscles, your glands, and all the receptors of your body. Now, what we'll see is that each spinal nerve is actually the union, right, the coming together, the traveling together of thousands of both sensory and motor neurons, right? More specifically, the axons. Because what's a nerve? A bundle of axons, aka a bundle of nerve fibers. Right? So you bundle a bunch of nerve fibers together and you have a nerve. What did we just see a moment ago? All of your motor axons, those both autonomic and somatic motor neurons. Go back and look. They were in the yellow and in the red regions. I know your page isn't in color. Again, another reason maybe to drop a quarter in the copy machine and make a color copy of that one image, right, with the colored images on it. But your motor axons, where do they start from? You agree they start back in the spinal cord? In fact, I want to go back and look at that with you. Where, right? So here are your motor neurons, and those little round circles represent what? Autonomic and somatic motor neuron cell bodies. All those cell bodies are found where? In the gray matter, in the nuclei of the spinal cord. Okay. And in that image as well, we just saw that each anterior root contained only motor information. Understood? Right? Each anterior root only carried motor information. Each posterior root only carried sensory information. And they unite, right? The anterior root and the posterior root are going to unite within that space that we know as the intervertebral foramen. Remember that space between the vertebra that the nerves are popping out from. And together, the anterior root and the posterior root, we collectively just simply call a spinal nerve. Now, up and down the spinal cord, what we're seeing in the cartoons and what we saw, if you go back and look at that cadaver image, you will notice that there are actually not just one coming off the spinal cord. You don't just have one anterior root and one posterior root. Instead, you have all of these rootlets, right? There are all of these little tiny roots, and all these rootlets merge to make one anterior root, and all these little posterior rootlets merge to make the posterior root. Again, right, a spinal nerve contains both motor axons and sensory axons, and each nerve is numbered much like the vertebra, C1, C2, C3. What we don't ever see, though, in our models upstairs is that once the spinal nerve leaves the intervertebral foramen, the nerve will branch into what's called rami. So a ramus is a branch, many branches, rami, okay, R-A-M-I. So one ramus, two rami. Think about where your spinal nerves are leaving the spinal cord or entering the spinal cord. They're way in the back, right? So what do you think is going to be bigger, the posterior ramus or the anterior ramus? you're already back, right? You're already very dorsal when you're thinking about your spinal cord. So does it make sense that there's a whole lot more stuff going on in front of your spinal cord than there is behind your spinal cord? So the posterior ramus would be rather small. And it is. We'll see this in a picture in a moment. And the posterior branch, the posterior ramus, would only go to innervate the deep muscles of the back and the skin. Whereas the anterior ramus is going to be much bigger. It's going to come around and it's going to innervate the rest of the body that's in front of the spinal cord, including the limbs. We'll also see that these rami are what are going to form the plexuses, or the plexi. So as those nerves travel together as a cluster, a plexus. Let's take a look at this picture and break this down. We've not seen too many vertebrae with the spinal cord in it. This is the first time we've seen the vertebra with muscle attached to it. So we're looking here at the spinous process, and in your back, right, you've got muscle that is, all over inside those little, between the transverse process and the spinous process. Coming off from the spinal cord, let's take a look. There's a spinal nerve. This little branch would be the what? It's going toward the back, so that would be the posterior or dorsal ramus. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot back there. So what is this posterior ramus doing? The posterior ramus, remember it's a nerve, it's a branch of a nerve. So what is it doing? It's picking up sensations on your back, isn't it? Right? So your sensory information coming in. But what else is traveling through that posterior ramus? Motor information going out. What I need you to remember is that within a nerve, you have both sensory and motor fibers. So in that anterior ramus, in that posterior ramus, you have incoming sensory information coming in, and you also have outgoing motor information controlling the muscles of your back. The bigger branch here would be the anterior ramus. So that's this one, much, much bigger on both sides. Now this anterior ramus has to do what? Go out and come around to the rest of the body, doesn't it? And continue to branch. I'm going to circle this, and we'll come back and look at this in chapter 14. Sympathetic trunk ganglion. When I'm doing that pre-recorded lecture tonight or tomorrow, I'm going to refer back to this very, very slide. I'm going to say, remember we looked at that little earring-looking structure? And what we're going to see is a little ganglion. Now, it's a ganglion, but I want to point out that this is not the same as this ganglion. If I circle right here, what is this ganglion? That bulge right there is what? That is the posterior root, or the dorsal root ganglion. That's the one we've been labeling up to now. But this is another ganglion, which is the sympathetic trunk ganglion. It doesn't make sense yet, but it will later when I come back and say, remember that moment. Okay, go ahead.
Is it only a spinal nerve until they split?
Or merge. Okay, remember when we're talking about nerves, we have both information coming in, right? So we would say that it's a spinal nerve collectively until it splits. Or as it's leaving, we would say it's not a spinal nerve until it comes together and
Only
leaves.
for a short time, like at the white area, is it considered a spinal nerve?
The nerve is-
beyond that, it's one or the other.
Right, so let me clean this off. So we would say that right here it's collected together. So this is we can't even see it here. Over here on this side, very, very light, there is the anterior root and there is the posterior root. Together they make the nerve. Then once the nerve emerges from the spinal cord, it's going to branch posterior and anterior rami. So when it all comes together, we have the whole spinal nerve, and then it comes in, and what does it do? It splits into the posterior root and the anterior root. If this isn't making sense yet, I think it will begin to make more sense right now. all over your body, there are regions of your skin. And each of these regions is called a dermatome. Derm, right, skin. And each of these dermatomes is assigned to, one way of thinking about it, each of these dermatomes is assigned to one of your spinal nerves. So in other words, every little section of your body, if you fall off a ladder and you go to the emergency room and they're going to say, can you feel this, can you feel this, can you feel this, can they feel this? And as they start at your toes and they come up your foot and up your ankle and up your leg, as they move up the body, each area of skin on your body is actually representing a different spinal nerve. So when they say, can you feel this, can you feel this, can you feel this, right? They're looking to make sure you don't have any damage to your spinal cord. Okay? So each of these little areas is called a dermatome, and every one of your spinal nerves, except for C1, it's a little exception, but every one of your spinal nerves, except for C1, is responsible for innervating, that is, sending signals, nerve signals to a region of your body, a region of your skin. So we can create a dermatome map, or we can say that you have sensory segments. So sensory segments making up this dermatome map. Now, this dermatome map, I think, is also going to help you understand why does somebody, when they're having a heart attack, what does someone complain about most usually when they're having a heart attack? Left arm, right? Left crushing pain in the left pectoral region, oftentimes, going down the left arm, okay? If I were to tell you right now, and my example here is different, here I have the appendix, but if I were to tell you right now, let's look at this picture, and let me come back to the heart attack in a moment. Here's your dermatome map. Okay, so what this is telling me what? If I can feel across my chest, right, I'm feeling across my chest from my sternum all the way down my umbilicus. If I can feel all that on both sides, what is intact? Those brown nerves are the thoracic nerves. Because each slice, each region of my body, I'm feeling because I have sensory neurons that are going to each of those spinal nerves. If I can feel well across my neck, my shoulders, right, cervical region, neck and shoulders. If I can feel down the front of my leg, lumbar. If I can feel it on the back of my leg, sacral. Remember what I told you a moment ago? More than a few moments ago. But the lumbar plexus, the nerves that go down the front of the leg, are derived from the lumbar plexus. So if you can feel your skin on both sides of your leg, on left and right leg, down the front, that means that at least your lumbar nerves are picking up their proper sensory information. Now, if you can also move the muscles of the front of your leg, right, your quadriceps femoris, then you know too that your lumbar nerves are both working sensory and motor. If you had spinal cord injury, and I'm going to draw it right about here, right, somewhere in this region, what would happen? You would not have what? If you had spinal cord injury around T6, you would not have sensation across your trunk or your legs, right? You would lose the use of your legs. You would be considered what? Paraplegic. Okay. You would still have complete use of your arms, wouldn't you? Okay. If instead, what if you lost, and I'm going to go to a better slide of this coming up, what if you had, let me jump to that and I'll come back to this slide. What if you instead had an injury up around C4? Okay, if you had an injury at C4, way up, right in the neck, cervical region. Now let's go back and look. If I had damage to C4, what would I not be able to feel? There's C4 right there. I'm going to lose the use of what? Arms and legs, and I would be considered a quadriplegic. What if I only lost low, the lumbar region? Then I would lose what? If I had to break at L1, I would lose all the lumbar, but also all of the sacral, right? Because everything from that point down would be disconnected from the brain. So what does that tell me? What are the problems that a person with paralysis has? They can't feel, nor can they move. Each region of your body, right, is controlled by your spinal nerves. So if you have, there's that T6 again, if you have damage at T6, then you would not be able to feel from any dermatome, T6 down through the lumbar and down through the sacral, but you also would lose control of any muscles that were controlled by those spinal nerves. We didn't go into that, all right, but in a moment I'll show you a couple of examples to pull this whole idea together. Now, one of the key things is here, if you have an injury to C4, you also would be on a respirator. Oops. If you have issues with C3 and C4 area, you're going to be on a respirator. And the reason is C3 and C4, that area also goes to your diaphragm. So if you lose way up in the neck, if you have your spinal cord injury at C3, C4, then your diaphragm is not going to work properly, and you would not be able to breathe independently. So you'd be on a respiration, some sort of breathing machine in addition. So that makes sense a little bit more that each nerve, right, each spinal nerve is not only responsible to a sensation, a feeling somewhere on the surface of your body, but also comes back out and provides motor control. I mentioned the heart attack a moment ago, and we haven't talked about it anywhere on here, but the heart is innervated by T1, okay, and T2 and T3 and T4. So here's my heart, right? But what I'm saying is that there are nerves. What kind of nerves would these be? They're going from the heart to the spinal cord. What are those? Sensory, more specifically, visceral sensory, right? So there are visceral sensory fibers going from the heart to where? T1, T2, T3, T4. Look where those areas are on the dermatome map. T1 goes down the arm. T2, T3, T4 are in the pectoral region. So the body is kind of confused. The body is saying, the body doesn't know. The central nervous system kind of, in a way, gets confused. And what's going on is this. The heart's in trouble. The heart's not getting enough oxygen, right? There's a heart attack going on. And the signals coming out of the heart are traveling through T1, T2, 3T, that area. And so you sense it, what? You sense it as pain on the surface. You feel it as pain down the left arm. You feel it as pain in the left pectoral region. Even though it's not your skin that's in trouble, right? It's not the muscles that are in trouble. It's your cardiac muscle that's in trouble. But you perceive it as being from the surface of your body. Likewise, if you're having appendicitis, if you're having a gallbladder attack, if you're having kidney stones, you might sense the pain somewhere toward the surface of your body based upon where these nerves are, right? And we're not going into that level of depth here, but let me show this to you. Let me skip over this slide too while I'm here. I had a student about 5 years ago whose mother studied reflexology. And I said, I don't know much about reflexology, so I'll look into it. And so I put this slide in here, and I still don't understand it, right? But a person who does reflexology would be able to feel your feet and say, you know what, if you're having trouble with this part of your foot, that's number 25, and number 25 tells me your kidneys aren't doing well. I don't know how that works. There's nothing that connects in the Western world of medicine, but on the Eastern side, right, there's these meridia and these things that I don't completely understand. I'm not poo-pooing it completely. I just don't understand it from my training. But if you talk to somebody who does acupuncture and reflexology, and they have a different way of approaching it, and I won't say hocus pocus. There's some legitimacy to it, but it's not quite what I understand. Yeah.
With my first pregnancy, I had my feet rubbed. I was nowhere near in labor, and my husband was rubbing my feet really hard. And I got up and I went about what I was doing, and my water had broke.
Mm-hmm.
And they told me that there is a spot in your foot, and it looks like 56, that causes some women to go into labor. It's that little spot right there. And I kind of
Right
thought
here?
this, I did the same thing, and I kind of poo-pooed it off too. And with my second one, I went in and got a pedicure, and they
56, uterus.
and they rubbed my feet, and I went into labor again. It's the second time.
So
there
the moral of the story is,
don't get your feet
rubbed late in pregnancy.
So I know that, I know that some people are more sensitive. I thought it was crazy too, and I guess why I went and did a pedicure, but I was in the hospital last night, so
But,
I wouldn't do
okay.
it again.
So, but I don't in the nervous system, right? I can see the nerves. I understand where things are connected. I get it. I don't get this, right? And if you talk to individuals who do reflexology, they have a hard time explaining it. It just is, right? It just is. And I don't get the connection, right? But I just put that up there, not to have you memorize any of this, not at all, kind of skip. But this whole idea of reflexology, that there are these areas of your feet that report to the rest of your body. What is legitimate, though, right? More legitimate, don't want to say anything horrible. Let me skip over this and come back to my referred pain. Where is my referred pain slide? I want to get there really quick. And it may not be I may be off. I'll get there later, okay? I'll come back to it. There's a figure coming up, and I'm out of sequence in my head. So let's go back to this, and we'll get to that referred pain. Paralysis. In these slides, I wish it was the other way around. The gray, the lighter area, is the area of paralysis. So on the far right-hand side, this person has lost the use of their arms and their legs, and so they are referred to as a quadriplegic. You know, plegia means paralysis, quad 4. So this is all 4 limbs are paralyzed. A person who has their full use of their arms but is lacking the use of their legs is a paraplegic. We've already said that word. A person, though, who has half their body paralyzed is said to have hemiplegia. Now, what sort of damage would cause or quadriplegia? From what you know, what would cause you to have bilateral, both sides of your body affected, both arms, both legs? Damage to the spinal cord. Whereas, what would cause damage to half the body? Yeah, brain stroke damage. And what we'll see when we get to the brain chapter is that most signals from the right side of the brain are going to cross over to the left side and vice versa. And so a person who has hemiplegia, if you go to the mall or maybe you know someone who's had a stroke and one side of their body is weaker than the other, and it has to do with perhaps they had damage to the left side of the brain, and that symptom, the result of that is paralysis on the right side of the body. So you'll see them, walking, and they may be dragging their right leg or pulling their right arm, or even, pulling it literally because they don't have motion or movement control over it anymore. That'd be hemiplegia. So it makes sense, right? The terms half paralysis, para, 2, and then quad, all 4. So what's a plexus? We know what a plexus is. A plexus is a group of nerves. Where are the 4 plexuses off the spinal cord? Up of the neck, cervical, going to the arm, brachial, going down the front of the leg, lumbar, going down the back of the leg, sacral. Those are groups of nerves. But even more specifically, what they are groups of anterior rami. Think about it, right? They are the branches coming off the spinal cord, right? Anterior rami, and they weave together to form these plexuses. Now, it's from these plexuses that we get most of our nerves that we're going to name. So, you tell me right now, in our list of nerves to know, what nerve, and only one of them, is coming off the cervical plexus? Yep. The phrenic nerve is the only nerve you need to know from the neck. And it is derived from the cervical plexus. So this group of nerves come off, and part of them, some of these different branches, will come back together to form what is we know as the phrenic nerve. And there they are, right? There are the four plexuses: cervical, brachial, lumbar, sacral. Now, listen to this, and then the description in a moment will make more sense. Most nerves, right, phrenic nerve, femoral nerve, brachial nerve, are derived from multiple spinal nerves, so that damage to a single segment, to a single area of the spinal cord, may not result in complete loss or paralysis. Okay? So the words are there for you, and then I'll show you what that means in a moment. What was the one area that did not have a plexus? Thoracic region. Pretty easy to imagine. Anatomically, these nerves can't travel as a cluster because they're already separated beautifully by the presence of the ribs. And so they cannot travel as a group. Now, that's going to include T1 down through T11. And we've seen these nerves, they kind of travel around between the ribs. And the thoracic nerves, these intercostal nerves, are going to be, if you look back at the dermatome map, you'll see that everything from pretty much the sternum down to the abdominal pelvic area, that whole front area is going to be thoracic, isn't it? The thoracic nerves. Chest and abdomen. And here's a cartoon. It helps you appreciate why there's no way they can cluster, because they're already separated from the ribs as they come off from the spinal cord. Okay, this should pull this together. So the cervical plexus, here's what I want you to know. The cervical plexus is a clustering of C1 through C4. Cervical nerve 1, cervical nerve 2, 3, and 4. And as they come off, watch them up here. There's C1, C2, C3, C4. And as these nerves come off, look what they do. They kind of branch and they cluster together as a plexus. And then emerging out of this cluster suddenly is a nerve, and the only nerve we're going to name from this whole thing is right here, the phrenic nerve. I'm not going to ask you to label this darn thing, right? But down here is the phrenic nerve. Right there, phrenic nerve, just this little fragment right here. Now what's significant about that is that the phrenic nerve is the nerve that goes to your diaphragm. The diaphragm is your muscle of respiration. So if you have damage to the phrenic nerve, then you're not going to be able to breathe independently after a spinal cord injury. This brings to mind Christopher Reeve. Right? If you saw Christopher Reeve, if you know who I'm talking about, Spider-Man, Superman, right? After his equestrian accident, he had some support. He was still dependent, though, upon the straw. He was still getting some support from the respirator, but he had some independence. So look what I'm about to say, and then you tell me where you think his damage was. The phrenic nerve is derived from C3, C4, and C5. And the phrase goes like this: C3, C4, C5, keep the diaphragm alive. Remember that little mantra. C3, C4, C5, keep the diaphragm alive. So that means that if you have damage at C2 and you have nothing to C3, C4, C5, you are absolutely going to be dependent upon a respirator. You're going to be a quad and be completely dependent upon a breathing machine. But what if your damage is down around C4? You're going to lose 4 and you're going to lose 5, but you're still going to have a little bit of 3. Okay? What I just said a moment ago was that most of our nerves are not derived from a single nerve, but from branches of multiple nerves. So let's follow this guy back. So there's the phrenic nerve. Look where it's coming from. A little bit of it from C5, a little bit of it from C4, a little bit of it from C3. Right, so the phrenic nerve going from your cervical plexus down to your diaphragm is derived from portions of cervical nerves 3, 4, and 5. If you lost all three, you have no phrenic function. But if you only lost C3, and you still had C4 and C5 intact, or vice versa, if you lost C5, but still had 4 and 3 intact above it, right? Then you would still have some respiratory support, wouldn't you? Okay.
So was he a C4 or C5?
I don't know which, but he's in that area, right? Because he had limited function. So he definitely didn't lose it all. He definitely didn't have complete function, and he was definitely a quad, right? So he had lost all 4 limbs and had some breathing concern. I don't know if he's C4 or C5, but clearly we see that he's in that range. We know he's not C2. If he were way up at C2, he'd be completely dependent. He wouldn't have been able to really have much of a respiration rate at all. And he definitely wasn't down at C6, was he? Because then he would have had what? Complete respiratory control on his own. Nancy?
I'm just wondering, did you misspoke yourself, or was that true what you said? If you knocked out 3, you'd still have 4 and 5?
No, that's where I flipped it around. That was my mistake.
Okay.
So you're always damaging from that point down. So I was trying to reverse myself, and I didn't. You obviously were listening. Good for you. So, yeah, sorry.
I thought it was, I'm not sure.
No, that's good. So what I'm saying is that Christopher Reeve must have been a break at what? C4 or 5, right? But he had a little bit of function, either one of the two, bringing down some information to the phrenic nerve. So when it comes to the cervical plexus, what I want you to know is that, what, C1 through C4, right? Those 4 nerves, those 4 anterior rami come together. They make the cervical plexus, and the only nerve you need to know from it is the phrenic nerve. And it's critical and important because the phrenic nerve goes to the diaphragm. That's what's important there. The brachial plexus. You know that it goes to the arm. The brachial plexus is a cluster of nerves coming off from C5 through T1. Now, a moment ago, I told you the thoracic nerves did not form a plexus, and that's true, they don't. But a little bit of T1, the very top thoracic nerve, does contribute and go to the arm through the brachial plexus. There are 5 nerves from this that you know or are learning from the lab. So if you look at this, here's your brachial plexus, all these nerves coming from C5 down through T1, and it goes on to form, and let's look at the next list, goes on to form, oh, there it is. Okay, there's an actual image of the brachial plexus. It's not an insignificant structure. Those are big nerves. And that 3-dimensional spinal cord model upstairs, those big white nerves coming off forming the brachial plexus. This is the good news, this is the bad news. But if you're having shoulder surgery, the good news is, right, these nerves are large. They're not easily missed. The bad news is they are large, right? I mean, they're easily nicked, right? So if you go in for any kind of shoulder surgery, right, I mean, there's always a risk that the surgeon could nick or miss and damage one of these nerves that would have a significant effect on your overall functioning and sensations in your arm. So here are the 5 nerves. You know them all. The axillary, median, musculocutaneous, radial, and ulnar nerve. Those are the 5. If you look on your Amerman list, under brachial plexus, these are the 5 nerves you need to know. They're all coming from the brachial plexus from C5 through T1, and they're pretty easy to label, right? From anatomic position, the ulnar nerve runs along the pinky, the radial nerve runs along the thumb, the median nerve runs down the middle. The the musculocutaneous nerve is up by the biceps, brachii, and the axillary by the deltoid. So definitely take a look at these nerves. Okay. Then we get down, let's look at this picture. Now this doesn't come from your textbook, but this gives you the overall picture, not to be memorized. We're looking at the axillary nerve. The axillary nerve comes from, again, just as an example, not to be memorized, a part of the brachial plexus, more specifically from C5 and C6. It's going to go to control your deltoid muscle and one of your rotator cuff muscles called the teres minor. We haven't learned that muscle, but it's deep in the shoulder. and it's going to give you sensation, just this little patch on the side of the body. Okay? So you just have a little bit of sensation up to your sort of acromial region, right? This orange area, and it's going to control your deltoid. So if you lost or had damage to C5 and C6, right, you would not be able to control your deltoid muscle, and you would not have sensation to that patch of skin. If you go back and look, guess what dermatome regions are in that patch of skin? C5 and C6. Right, so you would see that that area is C5 and C6. What about, again, just for example purposes, the radial nerve? The radial nerve, the one that goes down along your thumb, is a branching from C5 to T1, part of the brachial plexus. It's going to go on to control your triceps brachii and some other muscles that we haven't talked about that go down the arm. And it's going to give you sensation to the areas that are in orange on the arm. The one that's really cool, I think, is the ulnar nerve. Again, this is just for appreciating this whole thing. So the ulnar nerve is derived from branches of C8 to T1. It's going to go down and control the muscles that go to your pinky and to some of your fingers. Have you ever been reading in bed, or maybe using the computer and your elbows down on the table, and all of a sudden your fingers go a little bit numb, and you shake them off, and if you feel it next time, you might feel just this. There might be numbness only to your pinky, across your palm, just your pinky, and just the medial side of your forefinger. The other side of your ring finger. The other side of your ring finger would be just fine. Which nerve have you pinched? The ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve goes right across your olecranon process. So you got your elbow down, you're pinching off the ulnar nerve, and you're like, oh, my hand's kind of going to sleep. Feel it next time. It's going to be just a portion of your palm, just your pinky, and just one side of your ring finger. The other side, you'll feel just fine, because that's the median nerve and not the ulnar nerve. So again, there's very specific landmarks, very specific areas of your body that you're going to have control over or lose control of if you have damage to any of these particular nerves. So now what's the idea? These pictures, not to be memorized, but should drive home the idea that each and every one of your spinal nerves does what? Controls a subset of muscles and receives a subset of sensory information from your body. That nerves receive sensory and send motor down the same fiber. Not the same fiber, but the same cable, right? So down the same nerve. You've got some sensory neurons and some motor neurons traveling through that same nerve. From a holistic standpoint, from a whole body standpoint, is this making more sense? Let's go to the next plexus. This is the lumbar plexus. All you need to know is that it's L1 through L4. And the nerves you had to learn from this were the femoral, the obturator, and the lateral femoral cutaneous. Those are the three nerves. Again, look on your list upstairs. And those are the only three nerves you had to learn from the lumbar plexus. Where do they travel? Down the front of the leg. So they're going to give you sensation to the front of the leg, and they're going to control the more anterior muscles of the leg. Again, looking at this thing, this is not an insignificant structure. So these are big old nerves, right? Oh, while we're here, let's have fun. What's this muscle in here? I hope you're seeing that's the iliacus. Remember that muscle that was inside the ilium? And what would be this muscle right here? Psoas major. And those muscles came down right about here to make the iliopsoas. Remember that little conversation? Now do you see where you are? Now do you see where you are? Okay. I would never ask you that on an image like that, right? Now, what three muscles must you know from, again, the lumbar plexus? There they are. Femoral, obturator, and in lab you also had, I believe, the lateral cutaneous, right? The lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. Everyone agree with that? Those are the three nerves to know from the front of the leg. And then finally, there was from the sacral plexus up. Here's the same kind of idea. If you have the femoral nerve is derived from branches of L2, L3, and L4. The femoral nerve is going to go down to your quadriceps femoris muscles, your sartorius, your iliopsoas, your pectineus, and it's going to give you sensation as shown here. Again, not to memorize, just to get an appreciation of this. Finally, the sacral plexus, L4 through S4. L4 through S4. And the nerves you had to learn here, as I recall, were sciatic and pudendal. Okay? Sciatic and pudendal nerves. Again, larger structure. You're in the back. You're looking at the back of the gluteal region. Again, I wouldn't have you label these. And there were two other nerves that come down. So right here is the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve comes down the back of the leg, and then it splits into the tibial and the fibular. So you tell me, actually way up here. So it's going to split and go along the tibia and go along the fibula. The nice thing about nerves is that they're named for the body or the bone or the structure that they pass to or from or through. So the naming of nerves is not that tough. So when you're looking at your sacral plexus, learn the sciatic nerve and also learn the pudendal nerve, which is shown there. Again, if you had problems with your sciatic nerve, this is L4 through S3. Anybody ever had sciatic nerve pain? Okay. Usually during pregnancy, ladies will complain about it, right? And in the last couple of months, what's going on? Baby pulling out. That extra weight is causing what on the spine? What kind of curvature? Lordosis. Lordosis was that curvature of the lumbar spine. And where, therefore, would the extra pinching be on the nerves? L4, L5 area. And look at this, right? The sciatic nerve is L4 through the sacral nerves. So as that lordosis is occurring, as the baby's enlarging and as it's pulling forward, that the L4, L5 area of the spinal cord is getting tightened and getting pinched off a little bit. And now you feel those shooting pains going down the back of your leg, down the sciatic nerve. And depending on how bad it is, it can go just down to the knee or down through the thigh, or it can go shooting all the way down to the heel. It can go quite a ways down. Okay, each step you take can be rather painful. So again, all the nerves traveling down the back of the leg and all the way down to the foot are possibly zinging because of that. So does that make more sense now? Each nerve is picking up sensory information from one of these sensory strip areas, one of these dermatome regions, and each sensory nerve is sending signals out to a particular muscle. Cool that our whole body is set up that way, right? That somehow during development, each muscle gets connected to the right nerve. And there are very few variations on the theme. Questions?
I noticed that the sacral nerve plexus also innervated the pelvic area.
Yes, so that kind of makes sense, right? The pudendal nerve goes to some of the reproductive areas.
Okay, as far as, this is probably totally inappropriate, but injury to the spinal cord, I know that there have been pregnancies, and, well, not so much pregnancies.
Pregnancies of quads?
Yeah,
Sure,
and is
but they
that,
can't push, so they're going to be C-sections.
okay, that, and with men also.
Sure. Again, sperm don't, test tube babies, we can do wonderful things now, right? So we can take,
So there's absolutely no.
if you had lumbar sacral damage to the spinal cord, the male would not be able to move his legs, much less perform or have erection. But we can certainly get sperm donations, and we can certainly do, all that good magic. And then the woman, if she were a spinal cord injury, could sustain a pregnancy. It's a high risk pregnancy, but she can sustain the pregnancy, and the birth could be through through C-section. Now, there's some variation on that depending upon the severity of the injury, because the uterus might also be damaged through, right? Because if you don't have the right sensory signals going to the uterus, then the uterus would not be able to function at all. So I'm not saying completely, but there would be some individuals with spinal cord injury who would be able to sustain a pregnancy, women, and others who would not be able to, depending upon just the damage of their internal organs as well. That's not inappropriate at all, right? Okay, so in lab, we mentioned reflexes as well. So we're on the spinal cord, we've got about 6 minutes left. Let's just finish up with reflexes. So we know that these rapid, involuntary, automatic reactions to either muscle or to glands. And there's always in a reflex a stimulus, something that causes it, a response that is rapid and automatic and requires no brain activity. So reflexes are involuntary, and in fact there isn't time for the brain to get involved, and typically one cannot suppress a reflex, although people have been trained to do so. The CIA depends upon your inability to do it, but we know people have been able to beat lie detector tests. And really what they're looking for are reflexive changes. They're looking at the eye, they're looking at your sweat responses, they're looking at your heart rate, they're looking at your respiration rate. And with enough training and enough, I guess, motivation, it is possible to beat a lie detector test and to train your reflexes. Difficult, right? But not impossible, so they're not usually admissible for most cases. So the components of a reflex arc, again, there's always, right, something out in the peripheral nervous system that the receiver or the receptor of the information is now going to communicate into the central nervous system through a sensory neuron. It's going to communicate then out to a motor neuron that's going to go out to a gland or a muscle. So here are those steps. We saw them in lab. Okay, always a sensory receptor, always a sensory neuron going to the CNS. That'd be the afferent neuron. The information is then going to be integrated sometimes by some interneurons, and then a motor neuron sending it out to the effector. And what is the effector? Either a muscle or a gland, right? Muscle or gland. So just to put this whole thing into perspective, in your skin you have receptors. Something tickled you, something bothering you, a bug is crawling on your arm, whatever it is, right? And there's your sensory neuron. Oh look, this is a good review. Comes into the spinal nerve, and what's in the bulge? There's my unipolar shaped sensory neuron cell body in the ganglion. Information always comes in the back door. Synapses with an interneuron. Synapses now with an outgoing motor neuron going to an effector, in this case the biceps brachii, telling you to swat that bug away from your shoulder. Now, reflexes can be considered ipsilateral or contralateral. What does ipsilateral mean to you? Same side of the body? Ipsa, same. Lateral side. Or contralateral, contra means opposite, right? So, if I were to reach out with my right finger and touch the stove and burn my right hand, or my finger, then my right arm would pull back, wouldn't it, reflexively? All of the stimuli, all of the responses are occurring on the same side of the body, so that'd be considered an ipsilateral response. If instead, like in lecture or lab, I showed you that picture of the guy walking in his bare feet in the summertime, and he cuts his right foot, reflexively he's going to lift his right foot, but also extend his left foot, because both sides of the brain and the spinal cord are involved. Take it back, not brain. Both sides of the spinal cord are involved. We're going to call that a contralateral reflex. Okay? Now, contralateral reflexes are more complex. There's more going on, but still, there's a crossing over to the opposite side of the body.
When you, like when you were talking about swatting the bug, is there a reason that if we say we're right-handed and we have something land on our left arm, that we bring our right hand across, like go opposite sides? You're feeling the sense here,
Just depends.
and then taking your hand.
Typically, if you're swatting a bug, That's voluntary.
Okay, so it has to do with.
You chose to do it.
Okay, so that's.
You're not sustaining damage. Okay? Now, there's a fine line between voluntary choice and involuntary, but typically, if you're reaching across your body to swat the fly, you chose to do it, although it was very, very quick. You still chose to do it. Reflex, we're talking about even faster than that. Okay. Now, just a couple terms. Monosynaptic, what does that mean? One synapse. One synapse. So these would be the simplest of all reflexes. There are no interneurons. In other words, there's an incoming sensory and an outgoing motor. And in the spinal cord, there is no interneuron. One synapse, right? No processing. It just goes in, comes out. Monosynaptic, very simple, very, very fast. And your patellar knee-jerk reflex is arranged this way. So there's no processor at all. It just goes in, comes out, boom, your knee flexes out or extends out. And then we'll pick up with the polysynaptic reflexes in the last little bit. The last little bit of the spinal cord, just what, 3 or 4 more slides? We'll finish that up on Wednesday, and then we'll move into the brain. And then between now and then, be looking for an email from me, and I'll be pre-recording the conversation on cranial nerves and on the autonomic nervous system.